There is one job no CEO should delegate. That job is interviewing. Larry Bossidy, who turned around Allied Signal, said that the most important role of any manager was interviewing. Jack Welch spent over 50% of his time hiring because getting the best athletes in your team is the thing that will lead your company to success. And yet, we are so bad at interviewing. We've all been in those interviews where the person across the table looks like a complete muppet. They lunge like cougars at biases, at conclusions. And yet, we could, by implementing a structured, well thought out interview process, become great interviewers. The best athletes don't just turn up on the day and race. They spend months preparing and training. Usain Bolt didn't end up like that by just turning up on the day. So Scott's going to tell us why interviewing is important. Lauren is going to tell us the biases that affect our judgment. And Jorge is going to tell us how we can become better interviewers.
So interviewing well is important because it allows you to select and attract the best candidates. Pure and simple. You interview well, you'll be able to better select and attract the best candidates. So just by show of hands, who here actually interviewed in their job before the business school, before you came to GSB? Okay, me too. Now keep your hands up if, as part of that process at your old company, you were given rigorous training on what to look for or how to select the right candidates. Okay, so we have two hands. So even though companies and people like Jack Welch recognize that interviewing is really important, there's not a lot of training that goes on. In fact, oftentimes people report in surveys that interviewing is an area that they feel really uncomfortable in. And the bad news is, for all of us that are leaving the GSB and going to kind of middle management roles, if we go there, will be this discomfort isn't going away. It's going to get even worse as our job requires us to interview more frequently. Now, so you know that it's important to select the right candidate, but attracting the right candidate is actually really important. Because if you're like me, you've probably been in an interview where you face really silly surface questions that made you think, gosh, this guy who's interviewing me isn't that bright. And maybe you even felt like this little comic. Where do I see myself in 5 years? Another dumb question, prison. So these questions are silly, but a lot of times these questions get asked. And so just to demonstrate how bad some interview processes can go, we'd like to demonstrate a quick interview of an interview process that's all too often actually happens. So Andre will be playing the candidate at Dropbox, and I'll be playing the interviewer. And so, who do we have? Andre Haas. I'm really great at reading people, so I don't need to read his resume. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, hello. Hey, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself? It says here you went to the GSB. Hey, I went to the GSB, class 2003.
Great.
That's awesome. So maybe the first question, how's your golf game?
Oh, it's actually, it's really come on. I skipped a lot of classes to go on the course, so that's great.
Yeah, I like Dropbox, but hey, when I was GSB, that was an amazing place. Man, I miss it. I've been asking the other folks about modeling skills. That's important here, but based on your background, you went to GSB, and you can probably model pretty well, right?
I haven't done that. Actually, yeah, I'm probably pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, super. Well, I got some more work to do, so I think you're a great fit. I'd love to hire you.
Great.
Well, hey, welcome aboard, Andre.
Thanks.
So, how does everyone think Scott did? That was pretty terrible, right? Scott, you're fired. So, why are we such bad interviewers? Given the social nature of interviews, there is often significant room for interpretation. But it is not just intentional favoritism or stereotyping. It is instead, more often, one of the many unconscious cognitive biases that can influence our ability to judge talent and to hire effectively. So for instance, when Scott said, "You graduated from the GSB? Nice, me too. How's your golf game?" This is an example of similar to me bias, in which we develop an affinity for a candidate because he or she shares personal characteristics with us. So instead of focusing on the qualifications for the job at hand, we instead focus on shared background, or shared schooling, or the fact that we root for the same sports team. And similar to me bias can also go hand in hand with first impression error. As we heard from the first skit, first impressions matter. So what happens here is our initial snap judgments in an interview can set the tone and color the rest of the interview time. So no matter what Andre said in the next 29 minutes, those first few instances can affect how Scott reads whatever he says thereafter. And these two biases can go hand in hand with confirmation bias. So confirmation bias can occur when we seek information that reconfirms our pre-existing notions about an individual. And this can often lead to inconsistency in questioning. When we treat different candidates differently and ask them different questions. So we see this very clearly when Scott said, "I usually ask candidates about their modeling abilities, but given your background, I think that's unnecessary." So Andre gets a pass, whereas all those other candidates get hammered on question after question after question on analysis and modeling. This is unfair. Yet despite all of these biases, we don't realize our judgment is so bad. Why is this? Yet another bias, overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias occurs because we all think that we have better than average judgment and better than average intuition, and that we're better than average interviewers. So therefore, we don't even question what we think when we make judgments about a candidate. This we saw again in Scott's overconfidence when, before entering the interview room, he said, "Well, I'm really great at reading people, so I don't need to read this resume." However, these biases really matter. A couple of small examples. One, it has been estimated that over 30% of the gain in female orchestra members over a 20-year period has been attributed to the use of blind auditions, in which candidates play behind a curtain. And even further, some research suggests that over 35% of hiring choice variation can be explained by a candidate's obesity. So we can see that these biases really matter. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jorge to explain how we can become better interviewers and how we can use an interview process to overcome these unconscious biases.
So how does anybody become a better interviewer? As with all forms of strategic communication, the answer lies in preparation. I'm going to share with you today 3 steps which anybody can use to outline a process that is far more efficient than than what we've been talking about here today at actually selecting the right people for the job. The first step involves thinking carefully about the person that you're going to hire, about their job profile. Job profile, think about it as a picture, the ideal portrait of what this candidate is going to look like, or must look like, to fulfill the needs of the position. And it is this picture against which you can then compare every one of your candidates and ensure that you have the best fit possible. This portrait should be built around both background factors and personal factors. Both of these are intricately linked to the next steps of the process, so I will discuss them in more detail in just a second. The second step is to select for resumes that meet these requirements. Now, the resume selection stage is the gate to the process. And this is where you want to really focus on not letting commonalities or your gut feeling get in the way to allow them through the door. You have to focus on the education and the experience requirements that are required of a person to get this job. If you need a rocket scientist, this is an extreme example, but you of course need somebody probably with a degree in fluid mechanics or mechanical engineering and a PhD, for example. Now, once you make your selection, you go on to the last step before the interview, which is to devise a personalized interview plan. I call it personalized because you need to focus here on the personal factors of the candidate. These include intellectual ability. It has to do with creative prowess, analytical abilities, or decision-making process. You have to include personality. How dominant is this person? Are they extroverted? Are they patient and detail-oriented? These are important things to think about. Finally, motivation is incredibly important. This might seem like common sense to you guys, and you don't need to be a fan of the show Silicon Valley to understand the differences between hiring a CEO and a coder. But you'd be surprised to see how many people don't really think carefully about this before engaging candidates in interviews. Now, it's very important that you actually are focusing on the position throughout this whole process and not your personal preferences or ideas. Now we're at the interview. It's very easy once you get to the interview and you have a resume in front of you, to let that sort of take control and be your agenda. Do not let that happen. You need to come into this interview with a set of topics that you're going to use as your agenda. And these topics, the details are not really that important. It doesn't matter what the topic is. What you want to use this topic for is to open up the conversation. These topic openers will then give you information about the candidate, the specifics about where they worked, who they worked with, what specific project they worked on, or where they were educated. And here, that's where you launch the good questions. This is what the real interview is about. You want to focus on getting and delving deep into this person and their personal factors through probing questions, either self-appraisal or situation-based. As an example, you can ask a question such as, tell me about a time when you had to make a decision in a difficult situation for which there was no policy. Now, these kinds of questions shed light into their analytical or their intellectual ability and their personality. And to avoid people falling back on pre-canned answers, you have to delve deeper into those questions. How did the people around you react? How did you overcome those that were against whatever decision you made? And from this, you can make your own conclusions, and you can repeat the process over and over again until you have all the information you need to ensure that you have a fit of the candidate to the portrait. Speaking of conclusions, I will give it over to Andre now.
There is nothing more important than getting the rock stars on the rocket ship that you want your company to be, the best athletes in your team. Interviewing is the way to get those people into the fold. And yet, so often we're bad at it. We're bad at it because, as you've heard, we don't practice. We don't lift the weights before the race, eat our proteins, practice on the track. So we'd like to leave you with one message. Do the practice, do the training, and bring those star athletes into your team. Thank you.